Welcome. Come with us and discover the mysteries of Stonehenge.
The moment our fellow geeks, dweebs, nerds, and other unfortunates have been fervently waiting for has finally arrived. It's time for TMI, Confessionals of the Nerd Kind. And now, your hosts, Jeff Nerf Herder Chandler, Jim Kaiju Baker, and Christina Yojimbo Henry. You can continue. And now, let's get on with the show. Here is TMI.
The last two nights at Wrigley Field, there's been, I live 2.5 blocks from Wrigley Field.
Yes,
so,
okay.
There's been concerts. So Friday night was Def Leppard, Motley Crue, Poison, and Joan Jett. And then last night was the Zac Brown Band, which they've been at Wrigley like 3 or 4 times, and I still have no idea who they are.
So what happens? You just get foot traffic?
There's a lot of people, and then like depending on which way the wind is blowing, like the last 2 nights, the wind was blowing in from the lake. So I actually can hear them sound checking all day, and if I have the windows open, and then like, you can hear the concert at night.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay.
Sometimes that's cool. Like the Police were here several years ago, so that was cool. Like we just sort of sat in the living room and listened to the Police. Lady Gaga is going to be here in August, so I'm hoping the wind's blowing in for that.
Right.
But like, I don't care about the Grateful Dead, and Dead and Company were here 2 weeks ago, and I was like, yeah, we can just shut the windows.
Yeah. We're in at this point. I think we've been in since I hit record, but Jeff isn't here this week. As if you listen to last week's episode, you'll know that already. But yeah, he's not here this week, but he will be back next week. But because he's not here, we don't have an official news giver. But there is a big story that happened this past week. We lost a major player in Hollywood. James Caan has passed. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, even though Jeff isn't here.
And I have a small news item. I'm like your news correspondent.
Okay.
Which is a pretty cool thing. So as you know, if you listen to this show, that my most anticipated film of the summer is Jordan Peele's Nope. And if you've seen the previews for this, you've seen there's a kind of theme park that's featured in the film, that Stephen Yeun's character is part of this theme park. And the place is called Jupiter's Claim. And this fictional theme park is going to become a permanent part of Universal's studio tour. And it is opening day and date with the film.
So this is obviously Universal Studios Hollywood, since the Florida location doesn't have the studio tour.
Yes.
Now, is this the actual set from the movie?
Yes. They disassembled everything post-production. They kept all the props, and then they reassembled it at Universal Studios Hollywood.
Oh, so the tram will go through this,
I guess, so.
Little amusement park.
Yes.
Cool.
I thought that was really cool. And apparently it's the first time that like a movie set or prop or whatever is like opening day and date with the film.
So it better be a hit or nobody's going to care about this section of the Universal tour.
I think it will be.
I think it will be too.
First of all, his track record, but also just, I think that the previews for the film have been intriguing enough that, and I think I've seen a preview for it before every single film I've gone to for like the last 5 or 6 months.
Yeah, I think with Get Out and Us becoming such word of mouth hits, and then, during the pandemic, I'm sure more people than ever saw them. I think this is setting him up with this movie as in a really nice position. So yeah, I agree. It's going to be a major hit. I'd be surprised if it's not.
Yeah, I am looking forward to it.
Well, speaking of major hits, we have a hit on our hands this week with our main feature. And this isn't really a big surprise because you've been decrying the lack of adult content in theaters. This movie is serving us up some content right here. And I'm speaking as an adult, even though I love fanboy kids stuff. Elvis by Baz Luhrmann. That's what we're talking about this week. And just looking at the box office numbers, 85 million budget. This one is already at 150 million, and it's well on its way to doubling its budget. And I'm sure that it will. Elvis. So what was your theater experience like? How would you describe your fellow audience members?
So this is real interesting because we actually had to go on a Thursday, which is a time when we don't normally go to movies. But my husband had happened to take 2 days off. It was before the July 4th weekend. And one of the reasons he had done that was because my son, who, as I've mentioned before, is a Chicago Park District lifeguard. Please respect your lifeguards. He had off that day, and we had to try to, cram it in while everybody was able to go to the theater. So there was very few people because it was the middle of the week. It was a Thursday morning, but they were all adults, except for my son, who's 16. He looks like an adult, so he might as well be. But yeah, there were maybe 5 or 6 people, but it was an odd time to go.
I have a similar story, but I went on a Saturday, first showing of the day. I think it was 11:50 or something. And it was a pretty crowded theater, being a weekend day. And yes, it was all older people, but my son was with us, and he was by far the youngest in this theater as an 11-year-old. But I have to say, I was a little bit worried because I thought he'd be bored. But he actually never asked us when this movie is going to be over. How much longer does this have? So he sat there and watched it without a peep. So, and it is engaging. It is very engaging.
There's a few things I want to get into about it specifically. But before we start, I want to talk about your real world connections to Elvis, because one of the reasons my son knows Elvis is because I'm a huge Elvis fan. And the reason why I'm a huge Elvis fan is because my mother was the biggest Elvis fan in the world. I remember, now I was only 3. This is one of my very distinct memories, but I remember when Elvis died because my mother was standing in front of the television, weeping, watching his funeral procession on TV. She was absolutely devastated by his death. And if there's an Elvis song on, everything has to stop because it's Elvis. So I grew up loving Elvis, and I've passed that down to my son. And I don't know if you have a favorite Elvis song, or 3 or 4 like me, but I'd like to know.
Well, my experience with Elvis isn't as personal because Elvis was never in my parents' record collection. So my exposure to him has been on and off throughout the years. I don't remember personally when he passed. I do remember when John Lennon was shot vividly, but I don't remember when Elvis passed. So I've only known about him peripherally through the years. My earliest memory was probably my grandparents. For some reason, they had the Aloha from Hawaii on VHS.
Yeah.
So my grandfather would sometimes watch that. So, and I would see it as well. So that's how I knew him, was in the white
jumpsuit era.
The white jumpsuit with the bedazzled. So that's how I knew him growing up. And then obviously when you get into other things, you realize as a consumer of music that Elvis kind of ties to everything in rock and roll. So you can't not know, because he is seeped into the culture. So of course I know all the songs, and I've known them for quite some time, maybe not knowing that they were Elvis songs when I was a kid, but knowing these songs that you hear in this movie. But I will say that I have always loved the 1968 comeback special. And I have that record and I have that CD, and I think that that is phenomenal. And I take that out on a regular basis and listen to it. And I was so glad that so much of this movie was dedicated to that special, because it's a huge milestone, I think, in his career.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because there's really there are very distinct eras in his music. And I think that, obviously there's the pre-Army years, and then you have sort of the film era, which shockingly, when you think about it, is his mid-career. This is mid-career Elvis when he's in his 30s. And then, which is just devastating when you think about it.
Now that you say that, that, of course, I've spoken about this many, many times, but the 4:30 movie on ABC TV in New York on Channel 7 would have theme weeks. And I would always be waiting for the Godzilla or the monster theme week, but they would also often have Elvis theme weeks. And so besides Aloha from Hawaii, I knew him as a film actor. So that's another one of my earliest memories, is seeing Elvis on the 4:30 movie.
And then, of course, you have like the Vegas era, right?
Yes.
So it's like there's sort of like three distinct eras in his musical career. And I think that this film does a really good job of covering those three distinct eras.
It does. It does.
And I think that one of the challenges you have, Elvis he's an icon. He's more than just whoever he was as a person. And I think that what Baz Luhrmann does in this film is really get into this idea. I don't think he tries so hard to examine Elvis as a person closely. I think he tries to examine him as an icon. And I think that might be the only way to do it in a sense.
Yeah. I got that sense that the movie steps back from him a bit. So really kind of goes over the beats that the public knows about already. Because nothing in this was a surprise to me, being a casual Elvis fan.
Right.
Because I knew about, the early days, the pelvic shaking, going into the army, making the movies, so it hits all those beats that you would expect even as a casual Elvis fan.
I can't think of two subjects sort of better suited to each other, right? Baz Luhrmann is a maximalist director and Elvis is a maximalist subject. So it's like, who else could do this with this kind of style and energy and flair? But in the end, I'm not going to say there's a lot of verisimilitude, because he definitely plays fast and loose with the facts sometimes.
Well, that's always, I've said before that rock biopics are corny.
Yeah.
This has an element of that.
This is a rock and roll fantasy. And in the end, it actually reminded me a lot of Velvet Goldmine. Yeah,
well, it's Baz Luhrmann, right? So when it was announced that he was making this movie, and interestingly enough, at the start of our COVID pandemic, the first public figure to get it was Tom Hanks. And it was when he was making this movie in Australia.
And I was there. I was in Australia at the time on a book tour.
Are you an extra in Elvis?
No, I am not.
Are you keeping the secret from us?
I was just happened to be on the same island while it was happening. And actually because of COVID, Austin Butler, I read an interview with him, and who plays Elvis, and I think he does an amazing job.
I was a little bit on the fence looking at the trailer, because, initially, like, this young kid, he looks like a model. He's too perfect. But then when you actually see him in the full movie start to inhabit this role, within about 5 or 10 minutes, he's Elvis.
You believe it. Yeah. And he said that because of the COVID delay, they delayed about 6 months, and he was just in Australia waiting for the film to start. He basically immersed himself for 6 months in everything Elvis. He listened to all the recordings, he watched all the films, he looked for, any interviews. Like, he just sort of got everything completely sucked into his head. And he says he thinks the film would have been a lot different if he hadn't had that opportunity, which was forced by this pandemic, to really immerse himself in everything Elvis.
It works because all the reaction that I've read from, like, Lisa Marie Presley and Priscilla Presley laud this movie.
And yes, he is, his features are a little finer than Elvis's, but he, I think, inhabits to some extent that charisma that Elvis had on stage.
Yeah, I would agree. This is one of those really extraordinary things that can happen with a really good actor, is that physically they may not completely resemble the subject, but somehow they become the subject.
Yeah. And he certainly got down the way Elvis spoke. I mean, I think that was really one of the selling points, was that when he talked, he sounded like Elvis. If you see the soundtrack listings, he did sing a few of the songs, the ones early on in the film where he's on stage But later in the film, they use Elvis's own vocals and they mix them in with Austin Butler's. And I don't fault them for that, because Elvis's late career voice was completely different, than his earlier voice.
Right. I think that's what actually won him the role in the end, was his singing audition. Now, just looking at some of the other names that were considered, that were in the final running: Aaron Taylor Johnson, Miles Teller, Harry Styles. Now, I think these are all, even Harry Styles, I think that they're all accomplished actors. Aaron Taylor Johnson, you can't take anything away from him. Miles Teller either. But I think that because Austin Butler is a relative unknown to a lot of people, he's able to inhabit the role more so than I think any of those others would be, especially Harry Styles. You would be thinking that that's Harry Styles the entire movie.
Yeah.
Even to an extent, Miles Teller and Aaron Taylor, because you've seen them before.
Yeah. I think the only way to get around this is to cast a relative unknown. He had been in other things. I have not seen it, but apparently he was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah, he's one of the Manson family, I believe. Yeah.
So he has been in other things, and I guess he had a Disney Channel career when he was young. So he's one of these actors who sort of come out of those Disney Channel shows. But yeah, I think this is great for him. I think I hope this opens a lot of doors. He told a very, very touching story. He was on James Corden talking about how he was this is a long way around, but there's a point here. So he was in London. He was filming something else after Elvis came out, and he got to know Stella McCartney. And Stella McCartney had a show in Paris. And for some reason, he was still there when, I think it was Fashion Week. For some reason, he was in Paris when it was going on. And she said, "Can you come to my show?" And he said, "Well, I can't come to the show. I have this train. I have to get back to London." And she was like, "Well, see if you can get a later train and come to the show." So he called the train company and he said, well, I can't, can I switch to this other train? And they said, no, there's no seats. So he calls back Stella and says, "I can't do it." And she goes, "Let me have Dad call." And of course, we know who Dad is. Some guy named McCartney. And so Paul McCartney called and got it set up so that Austin would go back on the train later in the day with them.
Who did he call? The ticket attendant?
I have no idea. Like, Paul McCartney calls you. You do what he wants. That's how this works. So Austin went to the show, and then he took the train back from Paris to London with Paul McCartney and Stella McCartney. And they were sitting on the train and talking about various things. And then the subject of Elvis came up, and then Austin said, "What was it like meeting Elvis?" And Paul McCartney talked about driving to Beverly Hills. And he said, you get there and he opens the door and he's beautiful. And came in and they were sitting around the room and they were, just fiddling. And Elvis started fiddling around the bass guitar. And Paul says, "Oh, I play the bass." And then he took the bass and then he starts playing it. And then Elvis took a guitar and then they were all just kind of noodling around. And Paul McCartney said, as all this is happening, there's a jukebox in the corner that's playing a song. And he said to Austin, "Have you ever heard this song?" I can't remember off the top of my head what the title was. And Austin said, "No, I don't know it." And Paul says, Stella, find it." So they find it on the phone. And then they put in the headphones and Paul's listening in one ear and Austin's listening in the other. And Austin said it was the most amazing thing that ever happened to him, because here he was, the actor who'd played Elvis, sitting with a Beatle who had met Elvis, listening to the same song that they listened to when he actually met Elvis in real life.
Wow.
I thought that was such an amazing story.
Now, this story has made circulation in Beatles lore as well, of course. Because there's so much said by the Beatles about Elvis because he was such a huge influence. And it's just funny to hear all their individual takes, especially if you watch something like Beatles Anthology on this meeting. Because Paul, I think, is the most besotted about the meeting. Yeah. But then you get somebody like George's take. And he's just talking about, I was just trying to find some reefer off of his Memphis Mafia guys while I was there. And then John, who's very caustic about it and pessimistic, saying, well, I think that he really died the day that he joined the Army, because John is a huge Elvis fan of the 50s Elvis.
Right.
So if you're looking at the postage stamps of Elvis early, Elvis in the Army, and then Elvis with the sequin suit, John would only have the early one.
Right.
And then you get Ringo, who's just happy to be there.
Right. John is a fan of the dangerous Elvis, right?
Yeah,
and there was
of course.
That I found. So as we talked about this film, it does play fastly to the facts a little bit. Elvis did not have to go to the Army because of the Vice Squad. He went to the Army because he was drafted, which probably sounds weird to people, but it was a peacetime draft that was done during the Cold War to keep troops in readiness in case we had to go to war with Russia. And they actually knew this was coming down the pike for a long time. And the Army Draft Board had been trying to solve this problem of how do we draft the biggest star in the country into the Army? And, what do we do with him when he gets there? They had tried coming up with different plans, like he was going to have a special team, or like maybe he would just do basic training and then he would sing to the troops for 2 years or something. They weren't really sure what to do with them. And in the end, Elvis said that he wanted to be like a regular soldier. So and he ended up being not so much a regular soldier because he did not live in the barracks. He lived in a hotel off the base in Germany.
Well, this is interesting because this is an aspect of Elvis that I never really knew too much about. Like I knew he went into the Army. I don't know what the details are. I know he met Priscilla, but that's about it. So I'm curious about this, about what you're saying here. And the movie kind of glosses over that period really quickly.
Yeah, it
does. And then there's the controversy about how old Priscilla was
14.
When all they say in the movie is that she's a teenager. They don't say how old she is.
Yeah, the film really skates around this topic. So she was 14 and he was 24.
Wow.
He was 10 years older than her. Now, Priscilla claims to this day that there was no funny business, that they were always chaperoned, and that they did not consummate their relationship until they were married when she was 21. And Elvis always said the same thing. He used to say, oh, well, you're too young, Priscilla, and, we'll wait, that kind of thing. But still.
So what year were they married?
They were married in 68.
68. And the movie does touch on that, but I just couldn't remember the date. And I remember thinking to myself, I thought that had happened a lot earlier, but.
No, it sort of seems like it, right? Because he does start seeing her when she's so young. And one assumes that if she was a little older, maybe they would have gotten married earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But she was quite young. Even though the reason why he went into the Army wasn't because of the Vice Squad, there certainly was, and the film does a good job of getting into this, there was a lot of moral panic about him. And I found a great quote, which was from a Catholic newspaper in La Crosse, Wisconsin. It was a letter to J. Edgar Hoover. They were this upset about it that they sent a letter to the director of the FBI. Presley is a definite danger to the security of the United States. His actions and motions were such as to rouse the sexual passions of teenage youth. After the show, more than 1,000 teenagers tried to gang into Presley's room at the auditorium. Indications of the harm Presley did just in La Crosse were the 2 high school girls whose abdomen and thigh had Presley's autograph.
Oh,
so dangerous.
Yeah.
So dangerous. I mean, I think now when people look back on it, they think, there wasn't much to it. Now, everybody who's ever written about Elvis's live performances said that they were just something to behold. Even in the Vegas era, he performed amazingly on stage. He connected with the audience. People loved him.
Mm-hmm.
I think when people see clips of him on Milton Berle or something, they're like, what's the big deal? In the twerking era, you're probably thinking this wasn't much. And nothing that he did was sort of out of the ordinary for a lot of the Black artists who were performing at the time. But it's certainly for white America, this was craziness.
Yeah. And I think that, you're right. Even at his worst, it's going to look tame for modern day audiences. And I think that's why, and he needed to, Baz really plays up the sexual nature of what was going on. Like lots of close-ups on the pelvis and on the crotch as he's wiggling. So you're under no illusions of why this is so important and why this is seen as a threat. And of course, all the girls are seen in a state of sexual ecstasy in the audience rather than just screaming. And of course, this is kind of the corn dog aspect of a rock biopic. When Tom Parker sees this for the first time, it's the wiggling that's doing it. It's the wiggling, and it's the aha moment that a biopic needs.
Yeah.
And as he's looking at the girls as if this has never happened before, there was a guy called Frank Sinatra, a couple of decades before that they were screaming for. This is not the first person that the girls have screamed for in states of ecstasy.
It's just as a side note, it's funny that you say that. There's another podcast I listen to called American Hysteria, and she did a whole series on like boy bands and on fangirls and stuff like this. And actually, the first documented case of girls screaming in hysteria was for Franz Liszt, the German
Really?
Yes, in the 19th century.
Did he shake his hips as well?
Apparently, he was very sexy pianist.
Wow. So there's the aha moment that you need in a biopic. And it was there. Although this is, I think, there's tons of biopics like Rocket Man and Bohemian Rhapsody that have a ton of them. It's like every career moment is an aha moment in these movies. And it kind of needs that. You have dramatic license filming. I understand why filmmakers do this, because you want to see those moments. If you're a fan of Queen, you want to see the Bohemian Rhapsody moment. If you're a fan of Elton John, you want to see the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road moment. So you're being given that here, but I think it's in a more sedate fashion. I do think that Baz pulls back on those moments for the most part and just kind of tells it straight, which is surprising because I think that this movie is not as Baz as it could be. If you compare this to Moulin Rouge.
Yeah. Which is the Baziest film.
The Baziest of Baz.
Yeah.
So I think he pulls it back. I don't think that he gives it as much as he could have.
I think that, I think I'm going to be very interested to see what comes out on DVD because apparently he had a 4-hour cut of this film.
Yeah, I read that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently he did a lot of footage and he cut a lot of stuff back. And I think that he does do it right because he does use that comeback special as sort of like a peak moment in the film. It's like, sort of the framing
centerpiece.
device.
It's the centerpiece.
Yeah. Like everything builds toward it and then everything comes down from there. And it's sort of a nice way to frame the film. And again, you're trying to tell the story of a whole life and you're trying to create drama probably where there wasn't any necessarily all the time. Yes, Elvis's career had a lot of dramatic moments in it, but in the end, it's a life, and a life is, made up of little things that don't necessarily seem significant at the time. So you're trying as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, to create drama where there might not necessarily be any.
Yeah. And I loved, speaking of that, the thorough through of setting him up as, this dreamer of a little kid who reads comic books, who has the Captain Marvel thing around his chest when he goes to the ministry tent and he gets the spirit. And then they try to tie that in with the wiggling hips, right? The flashbacks of his performance. Yeah, he's got the spirit in him. And then how they tie it in at the end where you see that speech where he gives when I was a kid, I read comic books. I just love the fact that he was a fanboy. And I think he would love today's culture, I
think so too.
The Marvel movies and everything else. I think he would love that.
I think Little Richard himself did give a statement at one point saying that Elvis brought along a lot of Black artists who otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to mainstream America. There's a flip side of that. There's, Black artists who've accused him of cultural appropriation and basically said that he didn't do enough. But when he first started in 1955, he's 20 years old. The South is still segregated. The fact that he's even singing some of these songs is kind of shocking to white audiences. And let's remember, he was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. He grew up in Memphis. This is the Deep South. This is not a progressive time or progressive culture.
To your point, the movie takes pains to show you the correlation and the love that he had of that music. And I love that Little Richard scene. I think that guy was phenomenal. That
He
was playing
great.
Little Richard.
Yeah. He had huge respect, I think, for Black artists. Certainly without Elvis, a lot of those sounds wouldn't have made it into the mainstream. A lot of those sounds wouldn't have crossed over. So he did change music in a lot of ways. I just want to talk about for a second about the actual music, about his voice, which I love. And I asked you earlier if you had a favorite song.
I'll say, so I have to go back to the 1968 comeback special. And hold on, let me grab it here. So
He's got the copy of the album.
Where are you, Elvis? There you are. Like everything on here, actually. I love his version of Trouble, like which starts the thing. If I Can Dream is very affecting as well, which is the big number in the movie.
The film. They use that.
But I Can't Help Falling in Love is a favorite of mine.
That's my mom's favorite. My personal favorite, weirdly, in some ways, is Suspicious Minds. I love Suspicious Minds because I think it's a song that shows his huge range, especially late in his career. But I also have a favorite from like every era because I love Devil in Disguise. That's from 63. Love Heartbreak Hotel, obviously. I love Little Less Conversation. That's like one that's a little more under the radar. People don't necessarily.
Yeah, I think with Ocean's 11 really put that one on the map.
Oh, really?
I think it was in Ocean's 11. It was in some Vegas movie.
But I can almost always listen to any Elvis song. But I love Suspicious Minds because I just feel like you really hear the range of his voice, like that deep, deep baritone. You can hear him like go up, hit high notes. I just think his voice is gorgeous on Suspicious Minds.
I feel that we're talking very little about the movie and mostly about Elvis himself.
I think it's hard not to because, like I said, he is such a figure and he means so much to so many people still, like not just his music, but kind of what he represents, right? This literal rags to riches story, like where he was literally born in a shack with a dirt floor. And he rises to these extreme heights, which, of course, the film shows that it was completely destructive for him and that the people around him didn't help him and take care of him. And think about it. If you're 20 years old and you become the biggest star in the world, that's just not good for your psyche.
And it was established already that he was a bit of a mama's boy, that he was, always kept and taken care of. Mm-hmm. It goes a ways to explain his relationship with Tom Parker, because again, somebody that I think that he felt he needed looking after.
And the way the film depicts that, it's like it is like a mentally abusive relationship where Parker manipulates him and sort of keeps him in place. There is some truth to that. There is some not truth to that, but I do think Elvis is probably an arrested development for sure.
Because, there's much to be made, and Elvis, in the movie at least, is very taken by the fact that Parker is such a snowman, like a Barnum type character.
Yep.
But doesn't realize that he's being snowed himself.
Interesting side note about Colonel Parker in real life. Do you know one of his favorite movies was Nightmare Alley?
Really?
He was apparently obsessed with that film.
Wow.
Yeah.
Understandably so.
Yes. If you were a carny, and he was a carny, before he started managing Elvis, he was really obsessed with that movie. Somebody was a young agent in training who had been on tour with them, like somebody who was working for, I think, William Morris, who said that Parker was obsessed. He would just sit very quietly and intently and watch the film over and over.
A good indication of what he was capable of as a snowman, as he calls himself. I love the scene where he pulls out the I Hate Elvis button.
Yeah.
There's people going to hate you. Why not make money off of it? We sell the I Love Elvis. We'll also sell the I Hate Elvis.
Most of the money that they made was on merchandise and on the fact that Elvis was given a writing credit on a lot of the songs, even if he didn't actually write them. They basically told he wrote a few of them. There's a few songs that are sort of known as Elvis definitely worked on, but the majority of them somebody else wrote, and they would put Elvis's name on it so that they would make the royalties. That's how you make royalties in music. You don't make royalties necessarily on album sales because the sales go to the songwriters. Or they would make a deal with the songwriters and say that if Elvis sings your song, we'll take 30% of your royalty, which is not insignificant.
Right.
In fact, Mike Stoller and Jerry Lieber, who wrote a ton of Elvis songs, like they wrote Hound Dog, they wrote Trouble. You mentioned Trouble before, Jailhouse Rock. They wrote like a ton of songs for other people. They wrote Yakety Yak. They wrote Stand By Me. Colonel Parker tried to present them with basically a blank contract with the line for their signatures on the bottom, and said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll fill it out later. Just sign here." And they were like, no.
And again, I know liberties are taken. I know that maybe he wasn't as bad of a guy that they portray in the movie. And I know that he was very important to Elvis's career. But then you kind of wonder going away from it. And I hope everybody does this themselves. And maybe you should look into this yourself to see what actually transpired. Because the movie kind of gives the impression that Parker was always working against Elvis's wishes. Sometimes Elvis went along with what he said. Sometimes he fought him on it. Like the 68 comeback special was originally Parker's idea for a Christmas special to further ingratiate Elvis to the American public at the time. And Elvis just wanted to get back to his roots. But the army thing, the movie presents that as Parker's idea.
Yeah. That wasn't the case at all.
Dressing up as in a tuxedo for Steve Allen, was Parker's idea. So it seems like the movie Parker and Elvis are always at odds. And it comes to a head when Elvis wants to tour the world. And Parker, for one reason or other, doesn't want him to, wants to keep him in the U.S. Then it's revealed that Parker isn't even Parker, that he's an alias. And he's afraid that if he goes abroad, that he'll be found out.
Which, as far as we know, Elvis never discovered. So,
and of course, there's a big scene where Elvis fires him on stage in Vegas, which is great drama for the movie.
It did not happen. Did not happen. He did try to fire Colonel Parker at different points in his life. But I think this does lend some credence to the idea that it was a little bit of a dominating, abusive relationship. He always tried to fire him through proxies. He would tell people he knew, tell Colonel Parker he's fired. And Parker would say, tell him that if he wants to fire me, he has to come tell me himself. Yeah, and which Elvis would never do. Somebody that's that taken care of. He doesn't face such situations himself. So whatever the veracity was of the actual events, it's pretty clear that Parker definitely took advantage of him. And again, dominated him, at least to the degree where he, as a grown man, didn't feel that he could come and approach him and say, "You're fired, I'm going with somebody else." Right. As he gets toward the end of his life, it sort of shows him as just this, this guy who's constantly working, for somebody else. And in the film, it implies, it was just because you loved him, us, the audience, right? Makes us complicit. You loved him so much and he needed your love. And that was probably true to some degree because Elvis apparently loved performing. It was also because even though he was making a lot of money, he was spending a lot of money. And not necessarily on himself, but apparently. Yeah, and the movie implies strongly that Parker kept him working in places like Vegas to pay off his own debts. Yeah. That he'd accrued. So you said I should do a little research about what really happened. So Alana Nash, I read an article written by Alana Nash, I think it was in Vanity Fair. She had met Colonel Parker a few times, and she said, yes, he could be terrifying. She said she was actually scared at one point when she was interviewing him. On the flip side of that, she said he could be incredibly funny. She said that she felt the film didn't really show that. She wrote a biography of Colonel Parker's relationship with Elvis. So if people are interested in finding out more, the book is by Alana Nash. I have forgotten the title off the top of my head. But one thing I like that the film does is at different points, and I think this helps make it feel more real. At different points during the film, you see clips, little flashes of the real Elvis, like real footage of Elvis mixed in with Austin Butler. And obviously they do this at the end. I noticed when it switched from Austin to Elvis at the end. I mean, that it's Elvis. It's the scene where he's playing Unchained Melody on the piano. And that is such a lucky recording that thing, because that was June 21st, 1977. He would be dead 2 months later. This is like the absolute worst period of his life where, he was slurring on stage half the time. He was completely medicated. He was playing in Rapid City, South Dakota, and he spontaneously sat down at the piano and started playing and singing Unchained Melody, and somebody hit record. Right. It's like a miracle that we have this beautiful rendition of this song. If you look at the photos and videos of Elvis in real life, and the film does this sort of through a montage, sort of quickly at the end, but he aged so visibly.
Yeah, he was, it's easy to forget he was only 42.
Yeah. I mean, from like 1970, even early in the jumpsuit era, he's still slim. He's still energetic. He's still Elvis. But I feel like from 75 to 77, it's just precipitous. You can just see like he is just getting beaten down by life. And that's why I say, like, when he was in 1956, when his first RCA album was released, he was middle-aged. That was his middle age, 21, I mean, it's so sad when you think about it. And that was the big takeaway my son had when he left. He was like, this is so sad. I'm like, I know.
Yeah.
He was so talented. Thank you, for the comeback special, because if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have had all that wonderful kind of later career Elvis stuff, like post-film career. Just devastating sometimes when you think about, like, he could still be alive today, right? He would be like in his 80s if at any point someone in his life had meaningfully intervened and helped him. But it just seems like people around him were all using him to some extent.
They were enablers too. They were a bunch of yes men that gave him whatever he wanted, which a lot of the times wasn't what was the best for him. And I think the movie also, it adds a lot of drama, because I think it focuses too much on this Vegas stay where it seems like he's a Howard Hughes figure that is stuck in this penthouse. And like it takes you out of Graceland for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really go back there.
Which is weird because he did die at Graceland. He was at Graceland when he died.
But again, artistic license. And maybe in this 4-hour cut, there's more there,
The one thing too, and the film talks about this, obviously how devastated he was when his mother died, but his mother was an alcoholic. She died when she was 46. We do know there may be some kind of genetic component to addiction. So you might have been predisposed to that. And then having been exposed to the pills, again, without anybody around to meaningfully intervene, I don't want to say it was inevitable, but certainly maybe he was predisposed to addiction. But I did get very emotional at the end of the film. I found myself tearing up. And then they show, the footage of him speaking, giving interviews. They show little clips of him walking, smiling. And I just got so emotional. And I think, again, it's because I do have this kind of connection. And I remember my mom being so devastated at his death, and just the feeling, like Elvis has always been part of my life in some way.
Yeah. And I'm glad that this movie is affording him a reappraisal. Mm-hmm. Which it seems to be doing, and it made me pull out the 68 comeback special again. So
makes you want to listen to some Elvis. Right? Which I think is a good thing. Maybe Elvis didn't die on a toilet in Memphis. Maybe, as Baba Hotep implied, he didn't die at all.
There are sightings to this day. There are sightings.
I think that really speaks to something culturally, about his impact, that people don't want to let go of him. Even in death. This man has been dead now for 45 years, and people still don't want to let go of him.
And I'm glad now, because when I was younger, there was a stigma that Elvis belonged to the earlier generation.
And I think if you look at the breadth of his career, again, for he was a young man when he died. He was younger than both of us. He had a 20-odd year career. There's such a range of music in there. He made 3 gospel albums, I mean, there's so many different kinds of music that he made. I really think there's something for everybody.
A phenomenal artist and a great, great movie. So what kind of buckets would we give Elvis out of 5?
I'm going to give it a 4 because I was impressed by, obviously, like I said, I have a personal connection and I was sort of predisposed to like this going in. I love Baz Luhrmann's work, but a 2-hour and 40-minute movie, and I never looked at my watch one time. I was completely engrossed in the film.
Right, yeah, because I've made it a pledge to stop looking at movie runtimes before I go into a movie.
Yeah.
Because I do not want that to cloud my vision or to set me against it right from the start. So I agree that I wasn't concerned with how long it was or how much of the day had gone by. I was there until it was over. So I would say the same. I also give it a 4 bucket rating. Because I thought it was solid. I don't think it hit the heights that Moulin Rouge did.
Well, hard to
that's
top.
still, that's the bar. But still, I love the fact that my son was interested. And because we get the Beatles channel on Sirius XM, they often play songs from John Lennon's jukebox or songs that inspired the Beatles. Elvis, Little Richard are on constant rotation on the Beatles channel. So he's aware of these songs. And to now know that he knows the story, I just think does my heart good.
Yeah. It's I think, like I said, my son has listened to a lot of Elvis, but I think just after seeing the film, it makes you want to go out and listen to more Elvis.
Yeah.
And maybe watch some Viva Las Vegas or
Lilo and Stitch, maybe.
Oh yeah. I mentioned Heartbreak Hotel is one of my favorites. I love the scene in Lilo and Stitch when she's laying on the floor listening to Heartbreak Hotel and she's nailed all the doors shut so her sister can't get in.
Right.
That is one of my favorite scenes.
That would have been a good pairing with Elvis, Lilo and Stitch.
Yeah.
We couldn't have done that without Jeff, though. There's no way we could have done Lilo and Stitch without Jeff. Yeah. But what we did pair with Elvis, is a classic in its own right. And these musicians don't quite hit the heights that Elvis did, but they came close in their time.
Maybe they did. They were the loudest band in the world, right?
Maybe in their reality, they did. This is Spinal Tap. So let's go to the concession stand and we'll be right back.
Good evening. It's intermission time. And during the next 10 minutes, we invite you to visit our refreshment stand located in the center of the drive-in. Our service is friendly and quick. You'll find hot dogs, hamburgers, pizza, your favorite candies, hot and cold beverages, and other delicious snacks. So add to your fun of watching the movie. Visit our refreshment stand right now during our 10-minute intermission. We're glad to have you with us tonight, and we hope you'll come to see us often. It's great to get out to the movies.
Okay, so we're back with This is Spinal Tap. And revisiting this movie, it's interesting to go back and see some of the critical reaction, some of the quotes that were put out there in newspapers. And a lot of it was saying, and a lot of people say this to this day, especially other musicians, how it seems like they're watching a real documentary.
Yeah.
That this does not seem to be far from the truth. And I think Gene Siskel actually said that if you aren't clued in beforehand that this is fake, that you will think that you're watching a real band.
Yeah.
And I wish that I watched that without knowing that it was fake. But even as a kid, I think I saw this probably when it, obviously I was 13, I think, when it came out in theaters, early 1984. And I was too young because it was rated R to go actually see it. But I saw it not too long after when it came out on VHS because it's just really language in here that's, gives it its R rating. As a Laverne and Shirley fan, that's Lenny from Lenny and Squiggy. So that something is up, that this is not real. And Meathead from All in the Family is in it as well, saying that he's this director. So I knew that it wasn't real when I first saw it. I looked at it as a comedy, but I would have loved to have not been clued in whatsoever and watched it and had just had the wool pulled over my eyes.
I think it would have been pretty hard because like there's quite a lot of cameos in this. Billy
Crystal for a second. Yeah.
Bruno Kirby, who's was one of my all-time favorites. I just always loved Bruno Kirby, whatever I saw him in. Fran Drescher, Howard Hesseman.
WKRP, right?
Yeah. So, there's so many little cameos sprinkled throughout, but I did also read that a lot of heavy metal bands thought, they're like, did somebody like spy on our lives? Like this actually is how it is.
Like, I think I read that Ozzy Osbourne did think that it was a real documentary, which is not very surprising. He probably thought that, Star Wars was a documentary.
But I want to say, like, in all seriousness, that Christopher Guest is, to me, one of the most convincing actors in the world. Whatever he does, I believe him. I think he's a complete chameleon. If you think about him in this, you think about him in Waiting for Guffman, think about him in Princess Bride. You don't even know it's the same person.
No.
I think he is such an amazing actor, and I don't think that people think of him as a great actor, but he disappears into whatever he's doing. He completely makes you believe. I just think he's amazing.
Yeah, he is the heart and soul of This Is Spinal Tap. Nigel is the heart and soul. David St. Hubbins is the prima donna, right? Yep. And so Nigel is the one that you cling to.
Right. And of course they have the ongoing joke about all the drummers dying, which is such a great scene. But also it's kind of a real comment on like the absolutely strange rash of drummers who did die young from heavy metal bands, right? Keith Moon dying. He was only 32 years old. Keith Moon.
Again, talking about how young Elvis was, but completely looked decades older than his actual age. You could say the same thing about some of these other rock and roll casualties.
Well, Keith Moon died of a drug overdose, prescription drug overdose, right? Same thing. He was addicted. John Bonham from Led Zeppelin, another drummer, who also was 32, and by the way, also really did choke on his own vomit. So it's almost
at least it wasn't somebody else.
It's almost edging into poor taste that they have that joke in the movie.
A little too close to home in terms of drummers.
That's one of my favorite scenes because, like a lot of the later Christopher Guest directed mockumentaries, almost all of this was improvised.
Which is perfect because the movie plays it straight enough that you could watch this as a real documentary. The comedy is interspersed, but I think it takes itself seriously just enough. And that cinema verite aspect to it, the improvisation aspect to it, the camera work aspect to it, it does not look like a legitimate Hollywood product. It does look like a documentary, and it does look like it's what is being said is off the cuff as you would in reality.
Dozens of people spontaneously combust. It's just not really widely reported.
Yeah, as does, poor Mick Shrimpton, the drummer here, who, by the way, the real guy, R.J. Parnell, at the time this was being filmed, he played drums on Tony Basil's Mickey.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, they all, can play and sing.
Which is obvious, when watching the movie, because they're all obviously playing the guitar.
And I think that helps because it doesn't feel like they're just putting their hands on the strings and not really doing, what they seem to be doing, which sometimes you're watching actors in films playing musicians and you're like, they're not playing that guitar.
Yeah, you just see like the shot shoulders up, and then you see the close-up of the hands, and then shoulders up again, and the close-up of the hands. Right. But yeah, they're actually playing. Now this was seeing this as a kid. That was my big takeaway were the songs, because they're so adolescent in their like bathroom humor and ridiculousness, like Sex Farm. Like that doesn't even make sense.
Well, or even like the first song that you see them sing is Big Bottom, right? And the first song that you think of is Queen's Fat Bottom Girls,
Right,
like, which is clearly trying to sort
and
of
you know what I caught about that song in this viewing is that they're all playing bass, which I never noticed before.
And this song is absurd. I mean, the Queen song is also absurd, but like this is even more absurd, right?
Right.
It's absurdity taken to 11, and of course, this is the
no, it's
source.
not. I still stand by. It's not as absurd as Sex Farm. I do not even know why you would write a song about a sex farm.
And like Stonehenge, it has like that slightly pretentious Led Zeppelin.
And I love
quality.
Nigel's pronunciation, Stonehenge, as he's doing the voiceover. The Legend of Stonehenge.
I mean, it reminds me of like some, like Kashmir or something, like sort of these like slightly pretentious Led Zeppelin songs, like where they're just taking themselves a little too seriously, even if they're great songs, or Iron Maiden, where they're like basing their songs off Coleridge poems and whatever.
Yes, yeah. And even, going into the prog rock, yes. And King Crimson, yes, even early Genesis are guilty of the 8, 9, 10, 24-minute epics.
Yeah. So like I think too, that's one of the things about the film that really works is like that it taps into those things that you saw in real bands, that you saw in real life, and that just makes it feel so true. Everything that happens on screen.
Also, love that scene where they're coming out of those cocoons and Derek is stuck in his during the length of the song and finally gets out when it's time to go back in. Love those moments. And of course, talking about Stonehenge, probably the funniest part of the movie is when the 18-inch.
I like the scenes of them when they're young as the Thamesmen, which reminds Ed Begley is the original drummer who just died in a bizarre gardening accident. I like that because it reminds me of early shots of the Who, like really early Who. That's what they looked like,
Yeah. And of course, in all these rock documentaries of guys that were around that long, you have to have the obligatory skiffle group that they were in, the black and white footage, where they're just, completely innocent and look like they're 12 years old with their bowl haircuts.
So perfect.
All those interview segments as well with Marty, where they're talking about especially the reviews and, shark sandwich, and like, that's not real. You can't print that.
The smiles, there's like both David and Nigel smile when he says that, and it seems very spontaneous.
Like they didn't know that he was going to say that.
They were taken by surprise. This is just one of those movies too that you just obviously like. These Go to 11 is something that's sort of entered the lexicon. It's like, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? People don't even think about the source of it or like where it comes from, but there's so many great lines in this movie.
Yeah. And it still is funny. It's not overplayed to me at all. Just when Nigel, like that pregnant pause when Marty suggests, well, why didn't you just make 10 louder? And then there's like 5, 4, 3, 2. These go to 11.
Yeah, right. And that's the thing when I say that Christopher Guest is so convincing. He has this blank stare. He looks so dumb. You know what I mean? And he's completely putting it on because he's truly probably one of the smartest actors in Hollywood. And he's so good in that moment, making you think he's just this dumb human being.
Right. And I love his meltdown about the tiny sandwiches and the tiny bread.
Yes. And he's folding folding the meat, like, and they're watching him fold the meat like he's making, I don't know, like he's doing an engineering project or something. He's like, and then this goes like this,
And Nigel, this is not going to affect your performance, is it? No. I'm just trying to tell you that this is ridiculous.
It's a disaster.
And I love the how they say, we talked about one of their drummers spontaneously combusts at a gig at the Isle of Lucy.
It's so good.
Elvis connection. as they do visit the
Yes.
king's grave. Although, from what I read, they did not film the graveside scene at Graceland. They actually mocked that up in California, to not disrespect. Although there is footage in the bonus material of them outside the gates at Graceland. I can't see how that would be mocked up.
Maybe they couldn't film inside Graceland or something.
Maybe they couldn't. I don't know.
I love the scene at the end when they're at the Air Force Base and they see Fred Willard and he says, "You are Spinal Tap."
Fred Willard is always so convincingly clueless in everything that he's done.
Yes.
Especially Best in Show. I love him in Best in Show.
Best in Show. Like, that is in the history of his great career in which he was never bad at anything. Like he's absolutely the best he ever was in Best in Show.
Yeah, and there's so much that just kind of passes under the radar here too in terms of dialogue and lines. I think it's one of those movies that you can discover new things every time. Like, if you're laughing still at the 11 scene, you might miss Nigel say something else. There's one thing where he says, where he's playing the Lick My Love Pump piano number, which is a beautiful number.
Playing this beautiful song.
And he describes it as between, he's inspired halfway between Mozart and Bach. It's more Mach, really.
Again, said with like a perfectly straight face, like almost in an undertone. And
he's impressed with himself. He's impressed with himself by coming up with it.
And Rob Reiner is just so bemused by what he's saying.
Yes.
And he's great too, because he's like the perfect straight man, to all these crazy things that they say, later when he's asking David about Nigel leaving. He's like, "I'm sure it'd feel much worse if I weren't under heavy sedation."
And of course, we haven't talked about the Yoko Ono figure.
Yes.
Of course, this is another trope in itself in real life. It's a real life trope. The character of Janine, who comes in and breaks apart David and Nigel's relationship, which is ultimately what causes Nigel to leave as she takes over the management of Spinal Tap. That character, I think, is a highlight. She's
very funny in that playing it straight way, right? Where she's very sincerely telling them that they have the larger dressing room at the puppet show.
And she's like, "Next time, put us above the puppet show on the marquee."
Yes, Spinal Tap. I love later when they're at the rap party and David says, "I've always wanted to do a collection of acoustic numbers with the London Philharmonic, as you know." And it's so perfect because, he sort of mocks Derek for having like these slightly pretentious aspirations, but he too has slightly pretentious aspirations. The even funny thing in retrospect is like 10 years after this movie was made, all the heavy metal bands were actually doing that. They were all going out and playing like these sort of acoustic versions of their songs with big orchestras behind them.
Because the MTV Unplugged era.
And you're just still watching it all the way through the end credits, because they're still running footage, like random footage from throughout. And it's
so what's incredible, they actually filmed 100 hours of footage.
I believe it.
And had to whittle it down to whatever this is. What, it's like 80 minutes? It's not even an hour and a half. It's a very short movie.
It's like What We Do in the Shadows. Same thing. Like Jimmy and Clement and Taika Waititi shot like hundreds of hours of footage because it was all same thing, like mostly improvised. And then they like whittled it down to like this, sub 90-minute movie, with just the highlights.
And some of the highlighted deleted material is on the Blu-ray. And there's a bit more with the miming waiters played by Billy Crystal and Dana Carvey. And Billy Crystal is telling camera that he owns this company called Shut Up and Eat, which is mimes serving food. And he says, just think about it. You're there and this mime is walking against the wind trying to get to you with these chicken wings. You want to help him out and eat the chicken wings after that ordeal he's gone through to get to you across the room. Interesting fact as well. Lenny and Squiggy, during the height of Laverne and Shirley, made their own album, guitar played by Christopher Guest as the made-up name Nigel Tufnell. So he is credited on the Lenny and Squiggy album from 78 or 79 as guitar by Nigel Tufnell. This character hadn't even come into being yet. So he took that name from the pseudonym on the album. So which makes it now a collector's item. I've never seen it, whatever this album looks like.
Oh, yeah. No, I've never seen this either.
No. And of course, we haven't talked about the scene where they get lost backstage trying to make their way to the stage.
And they keep trying to pump themselves up and they're like, rock and roll.
Yep. And then they find the stagehand in the back and he gives them the most convoluted directions to get to the stage. And they come back around and they find him again. Again, I can't stress enough that this, I think, gets funnier the more that I watch it.
I think that's sometimes the thing about comedies, like when you really enjoy the movie and you rewatch it, the first time you watch it, you laugh because you're surprised, right? The joke is taking you by surprise. But then the second, third, fourth, fifth time you watch it, it's the anticipation of your favorite joke that makes you laugh.
And it pays off every time. A sequel was announced just this year that Rob Reiner is looking to do a sequel with the original members of Spinal Tap. Harry Shearer and Michael McKean took part in the Hearing Aid benefit record, which some of you may remember came out as a response to Do They Know It's Christmas and We Are the World, but it was a group ensemble of heavy metal people playing this song called Stars. So they were just part of it. And I wonder how many of those other heavy metalers just thought that they were in Spinal Tap and not actors. Yeah. Oh, Spinal Tap. Yeah, I saw your movie.
Probably depends on how medicated they were.
Yes.
At the time of the recording.
Metallica's Black Album was an homage to Smell the Glove. IMDb for a time was allowing their users to rate Spinal Tap on a 1 to 11 scale. I don't think they're doing it anymore, though. It's just 1 to 10, as everything else is. So lots of interesting backstories around this. What kind of buckets would we give This Is Spinal Tap?
Say like 4.5. This is a movie I watch fairly frequently, I think.
I think this is a landmark of comedy, of mockumentary, of whatever you might want to call it. I'm going to equal you here. So we're on the same page with both of these movies. I'll give it a 4.5 as well out of 5.
I just wanted to mention like a fun bit of trivia at the end when they're on tour in Japan. Nigel is wearing a Sadaharu O jersey. It says Giants across the front. It's the Yomiuri Giants, which is the Japanese baseball team. Yeah. Sadaharu O is the world career home run record holder. No one has ever hit more home runs than 868.
Okay, so location appropriate. His attire at the Japan scene at the end.
Yes. He's not wearing a San Francisco Giants shirt, if that's what you thought.
Or a Gumby t-shirt, because he seems to have an affectation for
Gumby. Or a Gumby shirt.
Does Nigel. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't mention budget and box office. It cost $2 million to make. It only made 4.7. So I think historically is more valued than it was at the box office at the time.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those films that probably, it's like once it makes it to VHS and then like people start see it and talk about it and tell their friends and show their friends and that then starts to grow and grow and grow and grow. This doesn't seem like the kind of thing that people would necessarily go to see in the theater if they didn't realize it was a comedy.
And of course, as we mentioned, probably every single rock band will find some truth. Unfortunately, so we'll find some truth in this movie. Even U2, look at the Lemon Tour, which is like right out of the Cocoon scene in Spinal Tap. There's lots of, I think, reality for some of these Arrested Development rock bands that are out there. What else did we do this week?
So I have already seen the film we're watching next week, which I saw yesterday because I thought we were going to do the recording for it today. So I bought my tickets a while ago. But also, I have a fun podcast recommendation. So I occasionally listen to, it's an interview podcast called Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard. And he interviews various people. Sometimes he interviews Hollywood people. Sometimes even interviews like scientists or like experts in their field or whatever. I don't listen to that all the time, but the Armchair Expert has sort of these sub podcasts that it runs as part of their feed. And one of the ones they're running right now is called Flightless Bird. And it is a journalist named David Farrier, who's from New Zealand, who, for COVID reasons, he came here to the US to do a project. And then for COVID reasons, he wasn't able to go back to New Zealand. So while he was here, he decided to find out what was up with all of our weird American obsessions. So he did this series called Flightless Bird, and it's about different things that Americans love. He has a whole episode on flags, which is shockingly interesting. One on burgers, one on Disney adults, which is a really, you could tell he was completely confounded by this whole phenomenon because, as he said, there's only one theme park in all of New Zealand. And it's like this little sort of kiddie place. So like adults don't get into theme parks in New Zealand. So he was like, what the heck is going on with all these adults who are in love with Disney? It's really interesting. It's really fun. It's ongoing. If you're looking for it, the podcast is Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard. And then in the feed, there's different episodes called Flightless Bird. And those are the ones you want to find.
Gotcha.
It's really fun.
See, what did I do this past week?
Did you finish Stranger Things?
I did finish Stranger Things. I was under the impression that this was going to be the finale of the series.
No. One more
I guess
season.
there's one more season. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you've seen it, right?
Yep. Yeah, I actually liked the season a lot. I thought the first season was just okay. I wasn't completely in love. My husband was in love. He watched it 3 times, the first season. And the third time he was watching it, he was like, come watch this with me. It's so good. It's so good. I didn't hate it, but I wasn't completely in love with it. But I loved the second season. And then I really didn't like the third season. So I was like...
I'm the opposite. I didn't really like the second season, but I loved the third season. Because the character of Bob just didn't do it for me.
I thought he was great. And that's one of the reasons why I loved the second season. So I went into this 4th season with, okay, all these episodes are super long. So if they don't convince me from the first episode, I'm out of here, but I really, because I'm just like, I don't have this kind of time for something if I'm not really into it. But I really liked this season. I thought they did a good job.
I love Never Ending Story in there. I thought that was the running up that hill moment.
I hated Hopper's character in the 3rd season. I just thought he was like toxic. Who is this guy? Like, where is the compassion that had sort of defined his character up to that point? I really, really disliked how they wrote Hopper in the 3rd season, and it bothered me. And I thought he showed a shocking amount of emotional deafness, let's say, to like the fact that Joyce was grieving Bob Newby, and he was just kind of like, get over it. It's like, guy's dead.
And see, but I loved the new relationship between Steve and Robin in season 3 as well.
Yes,
whole,
that was a
Scoops
highlight.
Ahoy.
Yeah, the Scoops Troop. That was a highlight of season 3 for sure. But there were a lot of things about season 3 that I didn't care for. I do love Maya Hawke. She reminds me of her mother. So
yeah,
much.
you can't. It's like I'm sure it's looking in a mirror for her. She sees her mother because that's what I see.
Yeah, she doesn't look exactly like Uma Thurman, but she resembles her a lot, and it's even just like her voice and her delivery. And
so what? We're gonna have to wait another 3 years for the finale of Stranger Things, and there's gonna have to be a time jump. They're all gonna be adults by the time come back.
They all already look so much older, even in the scenes where Sadie Sink's character Max was sort of, when they had the running up that hill moment in Dear Billy, and they're sort of she was flashing back to all the things that had made her happy, right? All those sort of happy moments with her friends. And there's a scene where she's riding her skateboard around Mike on the basketball court in the the gym, in the school gym.
Yeah.
And she looks so much younger in that scene, just noticeably so much younger. I'm like, they just can't get away with this anymore. I mean, she's 20 years old now.
There's going to have to be some concessions made to that. That's why I thought that maybe this was the final season. Like, the kids are aging out. Let's just end it. But maybe they want to end the decade. Maybe they'll push it to like 88 or 89 for the closing. Yeah. For the closing season. But next week, we are going back into the Marvel universe. Now, you say you've seen this already.
Yep.
I don't want to hear a word. No tells, no poker tells. Thor, Love and Thunder, another Taika Waititi movie. And we love Taika Waititi on this podcast. The opportunity came up this weekend. The whole family could have gone, but I saw Elvis last weekend and I was so excited after I saw it. I wanted to talk about it immediately. And my excitement was stunted because I had to wait a week before we recorded and talked about Elvis. So I did not want that to happen again. So I purposely said, no, we're not seeing Thor yet. I'm going to keep off social media. I'm going to try my hardest not to get any spoilers, but we're going to see it next weekend. Then I can talk about it the next day.
Yeah. I had to wait 10 days after we saw Elvis to talk about it.
It's not fun.
Today.
It's not fun.
But sometimes it's just like, it's, like I said, it's scheduling. And actually, speaking of scheduling, so my son had to work yesterday. So my husband and I went to see Thor because, I was like, I've got to do the recording about it today. I got to make sure I see it. So I had already bought the tickets. And then my son was supposed to go on Monday. And now his friend has to work himself at his job. And so now I'm going to see Thor again on Monday.
So you'll be extremely familiar with it by the time we speak of it. I certainly
will. Yes. So in fact, my husband and I discussed a few things. He's like, did you see this in the background? Did you see this? I'm like, yes, I saw this. No, I didn't see that. So like now I'm actually going to have a chance to sort of give it a second look.
Okay. And as part of the other things that we did this week, I revisited the first Guardians of the Galaxy. So because my son had never seen either Guardians movie, so I wanted to set him up because I know that they're going to be in this movie in some way, shape, or form. And of course, we're taking a Disney trip, so he's got to be completely familiar with them before we go on that new ride in Epcot. So
I just want to say, I've been hearing some things about this ride. Don't eat a big breakfast.
I'm hearing the same thing. Yes, that it is very turbulent. So I'm hoping it's not too, I did survive the Tower of Terror and ended up loving it. So maybe the reports are just a bit exaggerated. I'm hoping so anyway.
Well, I don't think Tower of Terror upsets your stomach in any. I mean, I've always
no, it doesn't. It doesn't.
I thought it was just I've always thought it was just a cool ride. It's always been one of my favorite rides. But the things I'm hearing about Cosmic Rewind are that, it turns you around so much. Like people are their stomachs are getting very upset on this ride. So apparently in a not so subtle move, there is now a garbage can near the exit.
That doesn't help if you're like get sick while the ride is in progress.
So just try to schedule that one not near a meal.
All right.
That
duly noted. Duly noted. But I do also have to, after rewatching Guardians, the first Guardians, I have to apologize to the makers of the Eternals. Because one of my criticisms about the Eternals was that Marvel's bringing in these characters as the Celestials. Where were they before? Why didn't anybody know about them? I had forgotten that the Collector, played by Benicio del Toro, the community that he is based in lives in the head of one of the Celestials. So I'm like, why didn't I remember this? They have mentioned these guys before, so I apologize.
And it's funny you say that too, because my husband mentioned that yesterday after we saw Thor.
Yeah.
But I'll explain the context in which you're talking about that next week, because, obviously we both had thoughts about this film and where it fits in the pantheon.
Right. All right. So thanks for joining us today. Hope you had fun. So we'll see you next week.
And go see Elvis if you have not seen Elvis.
Yes, please.
Bye.
Right. We have left the building.
Thank you very much.
Hey, everybody. If you like what you just heard, be sure to follow TMI Confessionals of the Nerd Kind on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or whatever you listen to your favorite podcasts on. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and then share it with your fellow movie nerd friends. It means the world to us and helps our listenership grow.
You can also find us on all of the socials, Instagram and Twitter at TMI_podcast 2018. We're on Facebook and YouTube as well. Just look for the Popcorn Bucket.
You can help support this show by visiting our TeePublic page for some TMI branded goodies such as hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, and stickers. tpublic.com/TMI confessionals, all one word.
A 5-star review would be incredibly nice as well. I'm just saying.
Thanks again for listening. We truly appreciate you. Be sure to come back next week. We'll save some popcorn for you. And actually, the first documented case of girls screaming in hysteria was for Franz Liszt. Apparently, he was a very sexy pianist.
Wow.